Hello, I'm Alex Sadi, National President of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Thank you for attending this webinar. Passage of the Drunk and Impaired Driving Prevention Technology provision, included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, marks the most historic legislative victory in MADD's 41-year history in terms of lives saved and injuries prevented. Today, we are joined by Stephanie Manning, MADD's Chief Government Affairs Officer, and Ken Snyder, who is a MADD volunteer and technology expert, who has also been personally impacted by impaired driving. We are going to discuss the significance of the new law, what it means, how we got here, and where we go from here. We will dive into the bottom line critical importance of meeting two essential deliverables under the law. The U.S. Department of Transportation, specifically the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, must establish a final safety technology standard within the required timeframe in the law, 3 years. And U.S. auto manufacturers must install this life-saving technology as standard equipment in all new cars, again, within the law's prescribed timeline, 2 to 3 years. We've come a long way. Since MADD's founding in 1980, MADD has made a huge impact on American society. We mobilized the nation against this national epidemic of drunk driving with MADD chapters in states across the country. Our educational messaging, combined with high visibility law enforcement, has reached the majority of Americans nationwide and helped create widespread public support. We won passage of history-making, life-saving federal and state laws, including the National Uniform 21 Minimum Drinking Age Act in 1984, the National DUI Standard of .08 BAC in 2000, and countless legislative victories at the state level across the country. The combination of these education, enforcement, and policy achievements have contributed to a 52% drop in drunk driving deaths since MADD was launched 41 years ago. But we hit a plateau. We realized 15 years ago that progress toward our goal of zero drunk driving deaths and injuries had hit a plateau. This is why MADD launched the campaign to eliminate drunk driving. A cornerstone of the campaign is to advocate for advanced technology in all vehicles to finally win the war on drunk driving. The technology portion of the campaign was initially conceived as a federal research program to determine the feasibility of technology to prevent drunk and impaired driving. Over time, it became clear that technology is the turning point on the war on drunk driving. More recently, we are aware that the numbers are headed in the wrong direction, and the increases are compounding year over year. Now, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Manning to talk about what's next.
Thanks, Alex. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, alcohol-related deaths spiked 14% from 2019 to 2020, even though vehicle miles traveled decreased by 11%. The 11,654 people killed in alcohol-related crashes is the single highest number since 2008. We are horrified by the drastic and unacceptable increases in the loss of life on America's roads during the pandemic, particularly when fewer cars were on the road. But our hopes have been bolstered by perhaps the single most important achievement in MADD's history, passage of the Advanced Drunk Driving Prevention Technology legislation signed into law by President Biden on November 15th. So why was the Advanced Drunk Driving Prevention Technology legislation needed? The problem was that despite automakers' promises over the last 15 years, it's been slow. The progression really hasn't happened, and the industry really doesn't have a sense of urgency about getting drunk driving prevention systems into all cars. You may be familiar with the DADS program, the Driver Alcohol Detection System for Safety. That research program, which exists because technology was needed to determine if a driver was at .08 BAC or above. That research program actually came out of a 2006 technology symposium held in New Mexico with then Senator Udall and Mothers Against Drunk Driving and the auto industry. Discussions began, can we look into working together cooperatively with the Department of Transportation on developing this kind of technology to stop drunk driving? This was before driver monitoring systems and the technological wave that we're all seeing now, with artificial intelligence and all kinds of amazing systems on cars today. We lobbied alongside the auto industry for funding for the DADS program. We were the biggest cheerleaders of the program. And in 2015, years after we got the initial funding for the program, and the auto industry was working in cooperation with NHTSA at DOT, we held a big event during one of the MAD national conferences with 500 victims at an unveiling of the DADS vehicle. At that event, the DADS program management said, along with the auto industry, that they would have this technology ready for cars by 2020. Of course, that has not happened, and the technology isn't ready now, but we're hearing again from the auto industry that it should be ready within the time frame of this rulemaking. The DADS program should be one type of technology that's considered as part of this rulemaking, but we've changed our course in the last few years, and you'll hear from Ken Snyder later in the presentation. Ken brought to our attention that there are hundreds of other types or examples of technology that need to be considered as part of this rulemaking. That includes driver monitoring and other systems he'll discuss. So we just need NHTSA to kind of take a look at what exists on the road today in a lot of vehicles, what the industry is currently working on. We know that they can solve the problem. Next slide. So the solution to this problem of not enough progress was federal action. The standard was needed to compel auto industry action, and it's a two-step process. Number one was the legislative campaign led by MAD victims and survivors, working alongside our congressional leaders who have been just incredible working with MAD victims and survivors across the country. We finally achieved that after many years of very hard work. We got the law passed with all of our champions in Congress and the president signing the infrastructure bill. Now we're moving on to the regulatory side and implementing this standard that MAD will stay with every step of the way. Next slide. So the interesting thing to note is that Americans support this federal action. In March 2021, we had Ipsos conduct a poll for us, and it showed that 9 out of 10 Americans support drunk driving prevention technology being built into all vehicles. 3 of 4 back congressional action to require the technology, and 8 of 10 believe that auto safety features should be standard in vehicles as they become available. So this brought us, all this new awareness the last few years brought us to this bipartisan legislative effort. A couple other factors were at play as well, including a very well-known crash involving the Abbas family, which led to the Michigan congressional delegation getting involved in this effort and help leading the way. That's what the HALT Drunk Driving Act in the House, that's who the HALT Drunk Driving Act is named after, the Abbas family of 5, mother, father, and 3 children who were killed in a horrific crash, who had close ties to the Michigan congressional delegation, which is the home of the auto industry in this country. And then in the Senate, the RIDE Act was also introduced. Next slide. The key was we had bipartisan support, which I'll talk about in a moment, but let's take a look in the House. This effort, named again after the Abbas family of Michigan, was really championed by Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who spoke at the family's funeral, where there were thousands of people from all over the state and almost every Michigan member of Congress in attendance. Debbie Dingell worked with David McKinley, a Republican from West Virginia, and Kathleen Rice, a Democrat from New York. This really, these 3, their efforts leading the way led to other co-sponsors coming into the fold. And I want to also point out some other transportation policy leaders who really helped shepherd and lead HALT through the House. In addition to Congressman Debbie Dingell, who has been critical, we also have Representative Jan Schakowsky, who chairs a really important subcommittee in the House. She's been a just tremendous champion alongside our victims and survivors. And then Representative Peter DeFazio, who also chairs another important House committee, which was involved in this process as well. And then Frank Pallone, who oversees the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It's all these members on your screen that really made this effort possible in the House, again, all through Debbie Dingell's leadership, Jan Schakowsky's leadership, and others. Next. In the Senate, the RIDE Act was introduced by Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico and Senator Rick Scott, again, bipartisan, which is really critical at this point in our times in DC, and co-sponsored by Senator Peters and Shelley Moore Capito. Important to note that Senator Peters is from the Michigan delegation, also spoke at the Abbas family funeral and has ties to the family. Ben Ray Lujan is a victim survivor himself, was actually hit head on by a drunk driver many years ago. Senator Rick Scott has personal ties to people impacted by crashes, drunk driving crashes as well. And Shelley Moore Capito has met with a lot of victims in the state of West Virginia. The bipartisan nature of this effort is really key. Next. So our victims and survivors meeting with all of their members of Congress, and we created a war room to do that and organize our campaign, which was done all over Zoom, interestingly enough. Their effort working with their members of Congress and making those connections and putting names and faces with their stories led to the HALT and RIDE Acts being included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed by the House and Senate and signed by the President on November 15th. Our legislation was folded into the nation's transportation funding bill that provides the bulk of funding for roads and bridges across the country. We want to take a moment to say thank you to our partners. All of these organizations really stepped up for MAD and victims and survivors and helped us, along with our congressional leaders, get this done via testimony, letters, and doing congressional meetings with us. This really was instrumental. All of these organizations were really instrumental to getting this legislation passed and across the finish line. So we want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone represented on the screen. Thank you all so much. Okay, so that was just a small snippet. We had just incredible, unprecedented media coverage when this law was signed by the president. It was really exciting to see that it was overwhelmingly positive in terms of the messaging from the media as well. So let's take a moment to talk about phase two, the regulatory process, because even though we got the law across the finish line and it was not easy, we still have more work to do. Now we've got to look at implementation at the Department of Transportation. NHTSA has 3 years to evaluate safety technologies and issue a final standard. Next. Automakers then have 2 to 3 years to implement the new safety standard. New cars could be equipped with this technology rolling off the assembly line as early as 2026 or 2027. It's also important to note that the new law provides 3 one-year off-ramps that allow NHTSA to delay setting the safety standard past the 3-year deadline if NHTSA deems it necessary. But from our perspective, from the victims and survivors' perspective, any delay means more lives are lost and more serious injuries occur. So our goal at MAD and why we're going to stay engaged is to make sure that this gets implemented within the congressionally mandated timeframe as soon as possible. Next. Now, it's important to note, we wanted to share this article from the Associated Press from October of 2021, that there are many safety rules that are years overdue. Let's take a look at this quote from the AP. The AP review of NHTSA's rulemaking activities under the last 3 presidents found at least 13 auto safety rules that are years overdue based on deadlines set in laws passed by Congress. In most cases, those rules are opposed by powerful industries as expensive, outdated, or restrictive. Other pending rules have been slowed by the bureaucracy or taken a back seat to other priorities. A lot of people along the way in this fight have told us how challenging this is going to be. Our response to that is Mothers Against Drunk Driving has never been involved in a vehicle safety rulemaking process before. We have sort of the heart and soul of this organization ready to stay engaged, and hundreds, thousands of victims and survivors who are going to make sure that this rule gets done and does not just sit and languish within the Department of Transportation. Next. But let's take a look at this case study in rear view cameras. Most of us who have cars from the last several years can't imagine having a car without a rear view camera, but let's take a look at how that happened. In 2008, the Cameron-Gulbranson Kids Transportation Safety Act was passed by Congress. A father got involved after he, of course, mistakenly backed over his young son, Cameron, because he didn't see him behind the car. There were a lot of families involved in this as well who were just devastated that they had no sight as they were backing up. So they got that law passed in 2008. 2011 is when the final rule was supposed to be issued. The standards were supposed to be issued for this mandate. But years later, the effort continued to flounder. The rule was delayed 5 times until finally, facing a lawsuit from safety advocates, the Department of Transportation announced that rearview cameras would be required in all passenger vehicles, and automakers were given 4 additional years to comply. So 2008 is when the law was passed and enacted. 2018 is when the compliance date actually took effect for automakers. So we understand that we are in for a long road. And we're here to make sure that this gets done as quickly as possible and to lift up victims and survivors' voices across the country. Now I want to turn it over to Ken Snyder to provide some more perspective on the technology and his personal story.
Thank you, Stephanie. I got involved with MAD and with this effort a little over 4 years ago when my daughter was killed by a drunk driver on her way home from visiting her newly born preemie twins in the NICU. And I'll tell a little bit more about that part of the story as we go along and talk about the technology. But I happen to also be involved with the automobile industry because I run an executive education program with roots in the auto industry called the Shingo Institute, and we're located at Utah State University. And I have many friends in many of the auto electronic supplier companies that use our model to drive improvement within their organizations. And so I started calling my friends and asking them, with all this great technology that's out there, isn't there technology that could be used to prevent drunk and impaired driving? And to a person, these executives told me yes. And then over the next several months, I had a chance to visit and talk with them in more detail, and they educated me on different technologies that could be used and how they could be used to prevent drunk and impaired driving. So there's 3 major categories of that they shared with me about the different technologies that are available. The first category is technologies that monitor the driving performance of the vehicle. These are things like lane assist, emergency braking that we saw in the video that the NBC Nightly News video we just saw a minute ago. Also includes things like blind spot detection, and the rear view camera is also part of the same ADAS system that assists the driver in being safe. And these systems can also be programmed to detect erratic or reckless driving, and as a result could be used as a way to detect drunk and impaired driving. A second category of technology is driver monitoring systems. These monitor the condition of the driver. These are sensors on the inside of the vehicle, not on the outside of the vehicle. They're on the inside of the vehicle. And the most common example is a camera that is faced towards the driver that can detect whether the driver has the eyes open or closed, or if they're asleep, or their head is nodding, or if they're looking out the window, or if they're texting on their phone even. But also when it comes to drunk and impaired drivers, they can also look at the pupils of the eyes, or how the eyes are, where are the eyes looking, and are they looking in the right place for the driver to be able to detect whether there's some impending danger that's coming up. So these driver monitoring systems can also be used to detect drunk and impaired driving. And the third broad category of technologies measure alcohol, and alcohol, the level of alcohol impairment. These are passive devices, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but they are sensors that can determine whether the driver is drunk. And also they mainly use breath, but there's also some examples out there that use touch systems. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this, because when this legislation was passed, a lot of the news people got it wrong and started saying that it's going to require breathalyzers or interlock systems in every vehicle. And the difference between what the legislation says and what a breathalyzer does is very distinct. The legislation calls for a passive system, meaning the driver does not have to do anything different than they do right now. They get in the car, they start the car. If they're a safe driver, they're ready to drive off. If they are an impaired driver, as Alex said on that NBC Nightly News segment, if they're an impaired driver, hopefully it can catch it before the driver starts the car. And if the driver starts the car and shows signs of impairment, the vehicle can respond by pulling the car over to the side of the road. These are advanced integrative passive systems that don't require the driver to do anything other than what the driver would normally do. And so don't believe some of the press reports that come out that say there's going to be a breathalyzer in every car. So with that, because there are multiple different technologies that can be used to detect drunk and impaired driving, MAD has decided that our best approach is to be tech neutral. We're not pushing any kind of technology. We think actually a combination of technologies are probably going to prove to be the most effective, but that's the sort of things that the rulemaking needs to determine, which technology or combination of technologies will be most effective at saving the most lives. And that's what we want to work towards. And it may be, if we can implement one technology that prevents a certain level of crashes, great, let's implement that now. And then as another technology comes along, let's identify that, and that can reduce another group of crashes that save even more lives. Let's do that when that is available. So we don't want to have perfect be the enemy of better either. We want that what technology can be used now, let's use it now. And as new technologies become available, yes, let's use those technologies then. Now, a lot of criticism has been raised about these technologies are not available. It's going to take a long time to create them. It's going to be expensive. And the truth is, the technology is available now. And many of those technologies currently exist on vehicles being produced today. And I'm just going to use one example of that, and that is the lane assist technology. Almost all new cars have lane assist technology on the car. What's missing is the software that programs those cars to detect erratic and reckless driving. And if they could actually detect the erratic and reckless driving that takes place, take over and safely drive the car to the side of the road. I'm going to go back to the example of the crash that killed my daughter. The drunk driver was driving 95 miles an hour in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. Multiple lane changes, very erratic, very reckless, sideswiped a car, almost rear-ended another car, swerved out of the way, hit an embankment on the side of the road, on the right side of the road, veered across 3 lanes of traffic, hit the center median, launched into the air, and came down and had a head-on crash with our daughter going the opposite direction. Now, the car with lane assist technology programmed the right way could have detected that this driver was driving recklessly and was a danger to other drivers on the road, and could have taken over and pulled the car over to the side of the road. There's no reason why technology could not have prevented the death of our daughter. And as I've heard so many different MAD victim stories over the last few years, almost every single one has erratic and reckless driving as a component prior to the time of the crash. And so if we can utilize the systems that are already on vehicles and program them properly, it's a software problem, not additional hardware, then we can have, it's not going to add that much expense to a vehicle. It's a one-time fix. And we can use this technology to prevent a lot of crashes and deaths from happening. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the options of the 240 plus different technologies that we've identified that might be used, one example is the program Stephanie mentioned earlier, the DADS program. This one has been around for a few years, and it's been delayed over a few times, but they have come out with a public announcement saying that the date has been adjusted to 2024 for breath-based systems to be available for cars to be able to implement on their vehicles, manufacturers to use on implementing it on their vehicles, and would fit within the regulatory and statutory guideline. So if that happens, that would be one great example of a technology that can be used to stop drunk and impaired driving. There's a couple of other examples I want to draw to your attention. Let me just focus on a couple of these. Let's start with Subaru. And Subaru last year was given an award by Euro NCAP, which is a voluntary safety effort within the European community. And they have activated the technology that's available on Subaru vehicles to detect signs of fatigue and impairment using the driver monitoring technology that I mentioned earlier, and also the driving performance monitoring technology in combination. And if the driver is determined to be impaired, to safely pull the car over to the side of the road. And so this is an example of where the technology is already being utilized. And when you saw Senator Lujan talk about why is Europe leading this and why isn't America leading this, I think specifically he's talking about Subaru and the next example, and we're going to show you a Volvo. So why don't we go to the Volvo one and show them. This was also featured in the news stories a little bit, this video was, but let's watch the whole video and then let me explain a couple of things, highlight a couple of things from the video once the video is over. So let's get that started and running. Oop.
Speeding, distraction, and intoxication disturb driver reaction times. We can address this by lowering speed, alerting a driver to a threat, and by detecting an intoxicated driver. Driver monitoring cameras allow the car safety to take action when necessary to keep people safe, inside and outside the car. Say, for example, the cameras register that the driver has taken their eyes off the road for enough time to create a risk. The car would then engage the safety support systems and issue a reminder to drive with care. If the driver doesn't respond to this, the car enters an emergency state. This would also happen if the driver closes their eyes for a long time, doesn't maintain a hold of the steering wheel, or starts to drive erratically. Here, the car reduces its speed and alerts Volvo on call, which immediately contacts the driver. If the driver doesn't respond, or if behavior doesn't improve, an emergency stop is activated, at which time the car safely pulls over to a stop. Volvo on call stays on the line and sends further help if needed.
So in that video, you saw examples of both the driver monitoring technology, but also it mentions erratic and impaired driving. That's using the lane assist to determine that the driver is crossing lanes in a dangerous way. So it's the driving performance technology that I mentioned before. So the combination of those two together can be more powerful than either one of those technologies taken alone. But the point is the technology is already on the vehicles today and only needs to be programmed to detect drunk and impaired driving and programmed to take the appropriate action if the driver is determined to be impaired. There's a couple of other examples. Let's go through these pretty quickly. The same system is on GM, and it's called Ultra Cruise. Some of you may be familiar with that. There's also some of these technologies have been introduced through Nissan. They had it on a concept car several years ago, and it's available in their labs. Toyota, incidentally, has patented some significant alcohol detection systems that they have not made available to the public, but in their patents indicate that it's a very sophisticated alcohol detection system that could be another solution that's considered by NHTSA to meet the regulatory guidelines. And with that, after that summary, the point is I just wanted to make is that these technologies are already exist and are either on cars or could be put on cars in a production mode fairly quickly. So we don't need to have a long development in this regulatory process. There doesn't need to be a lot of time for development. With that, I'd like to turn the time back to Alex to conclude the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Ken. So we know that lives are at stake. Some people believe that we should wait until the end of NHTSA's rulemaking process before implementing any life-saving technology. But as we've discussed, we're in the midst of record high increases in roadway deaths and injuries. We need urgent action because the lives of thousands of people are at stake. Waiting only means that more people will die and suffer irreversible injuries as a result of someone else's choice. We believe NHTSA should require automakers to implement the 3 categories of technology as each is developed, rather than waiting until model year 2027 to introduce them. Some want to go slower and say that the timetable for automakers to implement this life-saving technology is too stringent or unreasonable, but that's simply not true. Driving performance monitoring systems, which use exterior cameras and sensors to prevent crashes, currently exist and are available on many car models today. This technology should be installed as standard equipment in all new cars immediately, and the software should be programmed to detect impairment. Technology that monitors the condition of the driver using interior cameras and sensors is available, but is only installed on a small number of new vehicles as an added safety package at a very high cost to the consumer. The rulemaking should expedite the required installation of this technology in all new cars as standard equipment. This can be done as NHTSA finalizes the best technology options for drunk and impaired driving prevention technology, which could be part of the final rule announced as the part of NHTSA's 3-year timetable. As we noted earlier, the March 2021 Ipsos poll found that 8 out of 10, or 83% of Americans, believe that new auto safety features should be standard in new vehicles as they become available. We believe we can reach our goal of 0 drunk driving deaths and injuries. If you're a victim or survivor who would like to get connected to MAD Victim Services, please call our 24/7 helpline anytime at 1-877-623-3435. If you would like to get involved in advancing this life-saving safety standard, please contact policy@mad.org.